Flight attendant shouts at Black Colonel. Then his call changed everything. A sudden hush blanketed the cabin as the flight attendant's voice rose above the usual chatter, slicing through the atmosphere with an anger no one expected. A seasoned Army colonel, a tall, proud black man with a lifetime of service etched into his every scar, stood in the aisle, momentarily stunned by her accusatory shout. Passengers froze. The tension felt like a living force, thick and suffocating. No one dared speak. All eyes darted between the flight attendant, who trembled with volatile energy, and the colonel, whose dignity seemed to tower over the confined space. None could imagine how a single phone call would soon change every life on board. Colonel Jonathan Maxwell was no ordinary man. He wore his decades of service in the U.S. Army like a second skin. It wasn't just the crisp uniform or the ribbons on his chest, though those always demanded attention, but the quiet confidence in his gaze and the warmth in his smile. Born in a humble neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, Jonathan had dreamed of flying helicopters before he even understood what flight truly meant. When he enlisted at 18, fresh out of high school, he wasn't looking for medals or accolades. He wanted to serve his country and prove that a kid from one of the toughest parts of town could soar to heights once deemed impossible. Over the years, Jonathan rose through the ranks. He saw tours in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several undisclosed missions in parts of the world he could never fully reveal. By the time he was promoted to colonel, he had saved countless lives, both American and foreign, through his sharp strategic mind and empathetic leadership. Soldiers under his command admired him, describing him as a man who led from the front, who never asked of them what he wasn't willing to do himself. In tense combat zones, his calm, deliberate manner had kept morale intact even under the harshest conditions. But his service wasn't just about war. Jonathan volunteered for humanitarian missions, rebuilding schools and hospitals in conflict-ridden areas. He championed diversity initiatives in the Army, ensuring everyone, regardless of race or background, was given a fair shot at success. It was this unwavering commitment to equity that had garnered him respect across all levels of the military. When asked about his experiences, Jonathan would humbly say, "All I've ever wanted is to leave this world a better place. If I can do that, then I've done my duty." He was returning home on leave, just a short break before he'd be called back to help oversee an important training exercise. Standing in the airport terminal, watching planes take off and land, he felt a warm sense of gratitude. He had made it this far and still had the capacity to hope for a future that was kinder, more just, for everyone. That day, he boarded a Delta Airlines flight from Dallas-Fort Worth to Atlanta, expecting nothing more than a routine trip. Yet fate had something else in store. Nothing in his years of service had prepared him for the cruel confrontation he was about to face. The day was unusually humid in Dallas. Terminal C buzzed with a low-level frenzy. Weekend travelers, business people rushing to catch connections, families corralling children. Colonel Maxwell, dressed in casual civilian attire, carried a small duffel bag and a garment bag containing his uniform. He usually traveled light. His posture, always straight and dignified, allowed him to blend in while still projecting an air of quiet authority. The gate area was nearly full when the airline staff announced the first boarding group. Jonathan waited patiently. He knew he had early boarding privileges thanks to his veteran status, but he never flaunted them. He preferred to join the line just like everyone else, unless it was necessary. Among those bustling about was Lauren Parker, a flight attendant in her late 20s, who stood out due to her crisp uniform and blonde hair pinned into a neat bun. She seemed preoccupied, her brows furrowed. While other flight attendants greeted passengers with bright smiles, Lauren moved about stiffly, her gaze darting with an edgy tension. Co-workers occasionally glanced her way with concern, but no one confronted her. The flight was running on a tight schedule, and they had precious little time for personal issues. Colonel Maxwell noticed her too, but he didn't think much of it. People had bad days. He'd had plenty himself. He offered a polite smile as he passed, stepping onto the jet bridge. She barely responded, focusing intently on the ticket in his hand. "Seat 12C, sir?" she asked curtly. "Yes, that's right," he confirmed, adjusting the strap on his duffel. She briefly lifted her eyes, then looked away. "Boarding is that way," she said, voice clipped. Then she turned to the next passenger, effectively dismissing him. Jonathan, never one to dwell on rudeness, moved on. The cabin of the Boeing 737 felt cool compared to the warm terminal. He found his seat, an aisle just the way he liked it, tucked on the right side of the plane. He carefully placed his uniform in the overhead bin, ensuring it wouldn't be wrinkled or damaged during the flight. He sat down, buckled in, and pulled out a book from his duffel, a well-worn copy of a historical biography he'd been trying to finish. Moments later, passengers continued filing in, stowing their bags and settling into seats. The overhead compartments were filling up fast, and the usual dance of shuffling around to find space began. From his seat, Jonathan caught glimpses of Lauren's stern face as she oversaw the boarding process near the front. Something about her eyes betrayed a deep frustration or anger. He couldn't imagine how drastically that tension was about to erupt. About half an hour later, the plane was nearly ready for pushback. Flight attendants were making final checks, reminding passengers to power down large electronics and ensuring seat belts were fastened. Lauren's voice came over the intercom for the safety demonstration, a standardized script delivered with forced politeness. Jonathan closed his book, paying half attention to the safety briefing. He'd heard it countless times. Then, a sudden commotion near the front drew his attention. A passenger, an elderly woman who seemed confused about the overhead bin space, was struggling with her carry-on. Jonathan noticed that Lauren was dealing with her in a brusque manner. "Ma'am, please take your seat," Lauren insisted, her tone colder than it should have been. Seeing the older woman's confusion, Colonel Maxwell unbuckled and stood, prepared to help. He moved quickly up the aisle, offering a disarming smile to the woman. "Here, let me help you with that," he said gently, lifting her bag into the overhead compartment. The elderly passenger thanked him profusely. Lauren did not look pleased. Instead of expressing gratitude that a passenger was helping, her eyes narrowed. "Sir, please return to your seat," she snapped. "We need to prepare for takeoff. We don't need your interference." Jonathan's brow furrowed. Her reaction seemed disproportionate. "I was only helping, ma'am," he replied, keeping his voice calm. He sensed tension radiating from her. This was more than simple stress. Lauren's cheeks flushed. "Are you going to argue with me?" she demanded, her voice rising enough to draw the attention of other passengers. Jonathan could feel a shift in the cabin's energy. Everyone was now watching, ears straining to catch every syllable. He stayed composed, mindful not to escalate the situation. "Not at all. I'll return to my seat." But the moment he turned around, her voice lashed out even louder. "I've had enough of arrogant men thinking they can just step up and do my job for me. Why can't people just do as they're told?" Stunned, Jonathan slowly turned back to face her. His heart pounded. He'd been under live fire in combat, negotiated with hostile forces, and comforted grieving soldiers. Yet somehow in this civilian setting, a sense of disbelief washed over him. He could see the shock and discomfort on passengers' faces. The entire row behind him was frozen in place, eyes wide. He forced himself to remain calm, but the words echoed inside his head. Arrogant men. Something told him this confrontation was far from over. The aircraft door closed and flight attendants prepared for takeoff. Jonathan returned to his seat, buckled in again, and tried to refocus on his book. But his mind kept drifting back to Lauren's words. Her hostility had gone beyond mere impatience or stress. Though no direct racial slur had been spoken, Jonathan had lived long enough to sense when there was more beneath the surface. The intensity in her eyes, the anger in her voice. He had a gut feeling it wasn't just about him offering help. The engines roared and the plane began to taxi. A moment later they lifted off the runway. Pressed back into his seat by the force of acceleration, Jonathan inhaled deeply, exhaling any lingering tension. Once the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, flight attendants started beverage service in the aisles. Lauren worked her way systematically, avoiding eye contact with him, though Jonathan caught her glancing at him with an undeniable edge in her stare. He decided to keep to himself. He was only on this flight for a couple of hours, and once they landed, he could leave this unpleasant encounter behind him. But fate had other plans. As Lauren neared his row, an unexpected bout of turbulence shook the plane. Drinks splashed, overhead bins rattled, and a few gasps rippled through the cabin. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," Lauren announced, gripping the cart. She shot Jonathan a sharp glance as if he were personally to blame for the turbulence. Sighing, she pushed the cart forward, occasionally stumbling as the plane rocked. Jonathan exchanged an uneasy look with the passengers seated near him. An older gentleman in 12A whispered, "She's having a bad day, I guess." Jonathan gave a small nod and a polite smile. Moments later, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the flight smoothed. Jonathan quietly pulled out his phone. The airline's Wi-Fi was spotty, but he was able to connect. He typed a brief message to an old friend. Major General Rebecca McAllister, currently stationed at the Pentagon. They had maintained a close bond ever since they served together, and she had once helped him navigate a complicated bureaucratic snafu. He hesitated before sending. "Am I making a big deal out of nothing?" he wondered. Then he recalled the fear in the elderly passenger's eyes, the humiliating scorn in Lauren's voice. He pressed send. All he asked was if there was a protocol or a channel for lodging a formal complaint for discriminatory treatment. He had no idea that the response would set off a chain reaction he couldn't have anticipated. By the time they were halfway to Atlanta, Jonathan's phone vibrated with an incoming message. Despite the slow connection, Major General McAllister had managed to respond quickly. "John, sorry you're dealing with this. We take these matters very seriously. Send me a detailed account once you land. I'll loop in the right people at the airline and the DOT if needed." It was a measured, supportive response. Jonathan felt a weight lift off his chest, but at the same time, an odd sense of apprehension settled in. He didn't want to create a storm. He'd spent a lifetime navigating delicate military protocols. He knew how quickly a simple complaint could balloon into a media fiasco. Yet something about this specific incident felt emblematic of a larger issue. He'd experienced subtle discrimination in various forms throughout his life. How many times had he ignored or de-escalated it? Today, something within him said enough. A few rows back, two passengers quietly discussed the outburst. "Did you see how she yelled at him?" one whispered. "He's obviously a military man. That was so uncalled for." Even the man in the aisle seat across from Jonathan gently tapped his shoulder and said, "Sir, I'm really sorry about what happened. You handled yourself with a lot of class." Jonathan nodded appreciatively. "Thank you. I'm sure she's just under stress." After the drink service concluded, Lauren vanished into the galley. Another flight attendant, a younger man named Chris, took over the cabin checks. His demeanor offered a stark contrast, cheerful, apologetic, and diligent. When he stopped by Jonathan's seat, he lowered his voice. "I'm really sorry about earlier, sir. That's not how we usually treat passengers, especially someone with your service record." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "My service record?" Chris nodded discreetly. "I saw your uniform in the overhead bin. Thank you for your service." Jonathan offered a small, grateful smile. The tension in the cabin remained, though. No one could quite forget Lauren's outburst. By the time the flight began its descent into Atlanta, the atmosphere felt thick with unspoken questions. Some passengers texted or emailed relatives about what they had witnessed, setting the stage for a wave of attention as soon as they hit the ground. The seatbelt sign dinged on again, and the final approach began. Outside the window, the sprawling lights of Atlanta spread out like a brilliant tapestry against the darkening sky. Jonathan steeled himself. Once they landed, he would file the complaint and let the chips fall where they may, never expecting how explosive the situation would become. The plane touched down smoothly at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Passengers breathed a collective sigh of relief. As soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, they stood, eager to retrieve belongings and stretch cramped legs. Colonel Maxwell patiently waited, allowing the row behind him to pass into the aisle. He preferred a slower exit, letting the bustling crowd move on. Lauren reappeared at the front, a mechanical smile plastered on her face as she said goodbye to each passenger. She avoided Jonathan's gaze completely. Chris, on the other hand, quietly acknowledged him with a nod of respect as Jonathan stepped past. Once off the jet bridge, Jonathan found a quiet corner near the gates. He typed out a detailed email to Major General McAllister, describing the incident. Then, as she had suggested, he filled out an official complaint on Delta's customer service website, referencing flight details and approximate times. He was careful, concise, and factual, traits ingrained in him through years of writing military reports. After hitting submit, he felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. He hoped for a fair investigation and a resolution that might include an apology. That was all he truly wanted. Yet in the back of his mind, he knew how these things could spiral. Within an hour, as Jonathan waited for his connecting flight, he received an email from Delta's corporate office confirming receipt of his complaint. They assured him it would be investigated thoroughly and promptly. He also got a message from an old Army buddy who was now working as a liaison to the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Division. Word was traveling faster than he'd anticipated. Meanwhile, inside a staff lounge at Hartsfield-Jackson, Lauren's day was far from over. She sat on an uncomfortable plastic chair, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her shift supervisor, Diane Marshall, stood before her, arms folded. "We've had several passenger complaints about your behavior on Flight 347, Diane said, her voice measured but firm. Lauren's stomach tightened. She tossed her coffee cup in the trash, trying to appear composed. "I can explain," she began, voice quivering. "I've been having a really stressful day, personal issues. My fiancé lost his job. My rent is overdue. I let it get the best of me." Diane sighed. "I understand stress, but we have protocols. We do not shout at passengers, especially not a decorated Army colonel. This is serious. There will be a formal investigation." Lauren's face went pale. "Colonel?" she repeated. Her mind flashed back to Jonathan's uniform bag in the overhead bin, a detail she had angrily dismissed. Panic slithered up her spine. She could sense that the consequences of her actions were already set in motion, and they would be severe. Days passed. Colonel Maxwell had long since continued his journey, reconnecting briefly with family in Atlanta before taking a short flight to his next destination. He tried to put the incident behind him, focusing on the responsibilities that awaited him back on base. Yet, reminders of that day kept intruding. Each time his phone buzzed with an email update, he felt a knot form in his stomach. Meanwhile, Lauren Parker's world was unraveling faster than she could control. As soon as passenger accounts started pouring in, some even posted on social media, Delta Corporate launched a formal inquiry. Witness statements from the flight were largely consistent. Lauren's outburst had been both unprofessional and potentially discriminatory. The twist came when an internal note leaked out. Someone within Delta's management recognized Colonel Maxwell's name. He was not only a decorated officer, but also a liaison on multiple humanitarian projects that the airline had supported through charitable sponsorships. There were photos of him at Delta-sponsored events in conflict zones, delivering medical supplies and food, all while wearing a Delta baseball cap given to him by a grateful pilot. The contrast between his altruistic service and Lauren's treatment of him was too stark to ignore. The story started simmering on social media. A few well-known veteran advocacy pages picked up the tale of the disrespected colonel. They highlighted his philanthropic work, his numerous awards, and the humiliating treatment he had received on a flight with an airline that publicly prided itself on supporting U.S. troops. Outrage brewed. The hashtag #RespectOurHeroes trended briefly on Twitter, fueled by outraged netizens demanding an explanation from Delta. Lauren watched in horror as her photo circulated among flight attendant forums. Someone recognized her uniform and name tag from a now viral passenger video. Her phone blew up with messages. Some were from concerned friends, others were hateful and threatening. She refused to open most of them, terrified of what she might read. And then came the real shocker. Colonel Maxwell had never demanded her termination. In every statement he made, he emphasized that he sought accountability and training, not retribution. He even stated that everyone has a bad day, but that it was crucial for the airline to address potential biases. This revelation surprised Lauren more than anything else. Why would the man she had insulted so publicly be so gracious? Little did she know, the storm was only in its infancy. Soon enough, the forces in motion would grow beyond her wildest nightmares, and the path to karma would become decidedly less gentle. To outsiders, Lauren Parker's life seemed picture-perfect a few years ago. Born into a comfortable suburban family in Pennsylvania, she had a bright future. She studied hospitality and tourism management, envisioning a life of travel and adventure. When she was hired by Delta Airlines, it felt like destiny, a chance to explore the world and meet new people every day. But personal struggles lurked beneath the polished exterior. Her fiancé, Greg, had been laid off from a tech startup that went belly up. Their savings dwindled as rent and bills piled up. The stress of financially supporting them both weighed heavily on Lauren, far heavier than she liked to admit. She'd never told her supervisors about her situation, nor had she sought professional help. She carried the burden silently, her frustrations slowly corroding her normally sunny disposition. Things reached a boiling point the morning of that fateful flight. A heated argument with Greg ended with him storming out of their apartment. She left for work feeling abandoned, furious, and terrified about how they would pay next month's rent. In the break room before boarding, she received a text. "Don't expect me to come back tonight." She nearly broke down in tears but had to pull herself together just as her supervisor called for briefing. From the moment she set foot on the airplane, her mind was clouded with anxiety. She tried to hide it behind a stiff, robotic professionalism, but any little inconvenience felt like a personal attack. And then Colonel Maxwell stepped up to assist that elderly passenger, inadvertently triggering something deep within her. A twisted sense of inadequacy, the notion that others saw her as incompetent. The meltdown came swiftly, like a dam breaking under relentless pressure. Now, in the aftermath, as her phone buzzed with corporate communications and hearing after hearing, Lauren found herself thrust into a nightmare of her own making. She kept replaying that moment on the plane. She remembered the confusion and hurt in Colonel Maxwell's eyes. That expression haunted her dreams. She had grown up believing she was a tolerant, open-minded person. Her best friend in high school was African American. She had been to countless cultural events without a second thought. Yet that day on the plane, her anger had manifested in an ugly way. She asked herself, was I just lashing out because of stress, or was there something deeper, some prejudice I never confronted? The reality of possibly losing her job, her livelihood, and even her sense of self-worth weighed on her heavily. And for the first time in her adult life, Lauren realized karma was a force that could transform your life in the blink of an eye. News traveled fast in the digital age. A passenger's short video clip, capturing Lauren's raised voice as she confronted Colonel Maxwell, went viral. The clip was only 20 seconds long, but it was damning. Despite the muffled audio and shaky camera, one could clearly discern the hostility in her tone, juxtaposed against Colonel Maxwell's calm. Social media erupted. Veteran support groups rallied behind the colonel. "How dare she speak to a war hero that way?" read one outraged tweet. Others pointed out that racism and bias can be subtle, sometimes manifesting as aggression or disrespect towards people of color in mundane settings. Debate flared, with some insisting Lauren was irredeemable, while others urged empathy, noting the stress flight attendants often endure. Delta Airlines found itself under the microscope. A slew of media outlets requested interviews with both Colonel Maxwell and company representatives. Delta's corporate communications team scrambled to release statements that they were thoroughly investigating the incident and had placed an unnamed employee on leave. Reporters tracked down Colonel Maxwell through various military connections. He received multiple requests for comments, some from major national outlets. Preferring not to fan the flames, he issued a single, concise statement. "I trust Delta will handle this fairly. I bear no ill will toward the flight attendant involved. I only hope this can be a teaching moment for all of us." This stance earned him even greater respect. People lauded him for his dignity and grace under pressure, calling him a role model. The story spread beyond military circles, attracting attention from civil rights advocates. They praised his approach, seeing in it a pathway to address everyday discrimination and microaggressions without resorting to vendettas. At the same time, rumors swirled about Lauren's identity. Some flight attendant forums erupted in drama, with threads dedicated to dissecting every detail of the viral video. A small minority defended her, hypothesizing that she was just having a bad day. But the prevailing sentiment was shock and disappointment. As the days turned into a week, the momentum of the story showed no sign of slowing. New angles emerged. Colonel Maxwell's philanthropic work, Delta's record on diversity and inclusion, the broader issue of how service professionals handle stress. Each news cycle brought fresh perspectives and renewed calls for accountability. All the while, a wave of requests for interviews, talk show appearances, and even corporate speaking engagements began filling Jonathan's inbox. The story had become a cultural touchstone, and there was no going back to how life was before. Under mounting public scrutiny, Delta Airlines fast-tracked its internal investigation. Their legal and HR departments formed a special committee to review passenger statements, flight crew testimonies, and the short viral video. Lauren Parker was summoned to a series of meetings at corporate headquarters in Atlanta, each more tense than the last. In one of these sessions, she faced a panel of senior HR representatives, a union rep, and a stern-faced legal advisor. They questioned her for hours about her personal issues, her mental state that day, her specific interactions with Colonel Maxwell and other passengers. Shaken and exhausted, Lauren recounted everything. She admitted she'd been under immense stress, but insisted she wasn't a racist. The question that lingered was whether her behavior amounted to discrimination or was simply an extreme lapse in professionalism. Either way, she had undeniably violated Delta's code of conduct. Delta's leadership found itself walking a tightrope. On one hand, they wanted to demonstrate zero tolerance for racism or harassment toward passengers. On the other, they didn't want to appear callous to their employees' personal struggles, especially with a union contract in place. As the press coverage intensified, top executives knew the stakes were high. The company's brand and public image hinged on swift, decisive action. Meanwhile, Colonel Maxwell received a direct phone call from a senior vice president at Delta, offering apologies and assurances that appropriate measures would be taken. The VP invited him to share any final statements or requests. Jonathan, ever diplomatic, reiterated that he only wanted to see genuine steps toward improvement. Better training for flight attendants, better systems for accountability, and a renewed commitment to respecting all passengers. The VP promised to follow through. The result of the investigation eventually arrived in the form of an internal memo and an official statement released to the press. Delta confirmed that disciplinary action would be taken against the flight attendant involved, citing violations of professional conduct. They also announced a new training initiative, mandatory for all customer-facing employees, focused on unconscious bias, emotional regulation under stress, and conflict de-escalation techniques. To many on the outside, it looked like a textbook corporate damage control strategy. Yet to Colonel Maxwell, it felt like a step in the right direction. The real question was what form this disciplinary action would take, and whether it would truly address the root issues. For Lauren, each day felt like walking a razor's edge, uncertain if her career, and her life as she knew it, would remain intact after the final verdict. Some days later, Colonel Maxwell was seated in a quiet cafe near his base, reflecting on the whirlwind of events. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, thinking back to that moment on the plane, the anger in Lauren's eyes, the hush in the cabin, and the silent stares of the other passengers. Despite the public attention and outcry, he still felt more sadness than anger. He had a Zoom call scheduled in 15 minutes with a national news outlet. They wanted his personal reflections on leadership, discrimination, and how to handle conflict. Part of him wanted to decline. He wasn't someone who courted fame. But another part recognized the potential to turn this incident into a broader conversation about understanding and respect. His mind wandered to a time during his second tour in Afghanistan, when he'd been forced to rely on local villagers for critical information. Initially, there was mutual distrust, but over time he learned that genuine listening and empathy could break down walls faster than any show of force. People, both at home and abroad, responded to authenticity, to someone who saw them as more than just a label. What if Lauren sees me only as a threat or a symbol of her own insecurities? He wondered. What if she never intended to show prejudice, but it came out under stress? Before heading into the Zoom call, he made a decision. He fired off a quick email to Delta's HR liaison, requesting a private, mediated conversation with Lauren. If she was open to it, he wanted to extend an opportunity for dialogue. He had no desire for a public apology on national TV, only a chance to talk one-on-one, human being to human being. The Zoom interview began. As the reporter asked about his service and how he felt being at the center of this controversy, he answered with honesty. He highlighted that discrimination, whether intentional or not, was something society needed to address collectively. He spoke about the power of education, empathy, and second chances. Though he didn't know it yet, his words that day would strike a chord with thousands who watched the broadcast. They admired his willingness to move beyond anger and into compassion. But would Lauren accept his offer? Would she be ready to face him, to hear his story and perhaps share her own? No matter the outcome, Colonel Maxwell felt compelled to try. After a lifetime of service, he believed there was always a path to healing, even if it required stepping into uncomfortable territory. A swirl of resentment and fear had been simmering inside Lauren Parker since the day of the incident, on Flight 347. She had replayed that confrontation with Colonel Maxwell in her mind countless times. Sometimes, in the hazy moments just before sleep, she'd conjure a different ending, one in which she recognized her own mounting stress and diffused her anger before it lashed out. But reality offered no such revision. Instead, it brought a slow but devastating fallout, one she never saw coming. Within days of the flight, Lauren found herself summoned to the headquarters in Atlanta for a formal review. The corporate offices felt even more sterile than usual. Frosted glass walls and quiet corridors offered no comfort. Whenever she passed a cluster of employees hunched over their computers, she imagined them whispering about her. The flight attendant who'd lost her temper at a decorated military officer. She'd heard rumors that some executives saw her outburst as a potential public relations catastrophe, especially with social media abuzz. When Lauren first sat down with a union representative, a middle-aged woman named Trish who wore empathy like a second skin, she was hopeful. Maybe the airline would let her off with a warning or mandate an unpaid suspension. After all, she had nearly 5 years of decent service. But the deeper Trish dug into witness statements, the more unsettled her expression became. "Lauren," Trish said softly, flipping through the last few pages of a thick file. "The passenger accounts are unanimous. They say you screamed at Colonel Maxwell unprovoked, that you continued to berate him even after he tried to de-escalate. And well, there's a video." Lauren felt a chill crawl up her spine. She knew the clip existed. Someone had captured those damning 20 seconds on their phone, but she hadn't been able to watch it herself. She feared seeing her own angry face and hearing her voice laced with venom she hardly recognized. Instead, she'd spent nights scrolling through online comments, the bile of strangers' hatred fueling her insomnia. Some called her racist, others labeled her an embodiment of Everything wrong with customer service. A few took pity on her, chalking it up to a bad day, but their voices were drowned in the roar of condemnation. In the subsequent days, Delta's internal investigation intensified. The HR department asked for Lauren's version of events multiple times, combing her story for inconsistencies. She tried to be honest, confessing that her personal life was in shambles and that her stress levels were high. She emphasized that she'd never intended to single out Colonel Maxwell because of his race or his rank. But each time she spoke, she sensed how hollow her words sounded. Who would believe her now? The union tried to advocate for a moderated stance, perhaps a suspension with mandatory counseling. But the airline's executive board was already spooked by the public backlash. The corporate team saw daily social media storms, tags in viral posts demanding Lauren's termination, news segments championing Colonel Maxwell as a dignified hero. Delta needed to preserve its reputation at all costs. And so they decided to make an example of her. Lauren learned of her suspension through a curt email that arrived late one evening. One line stood out. Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid administrative leave pending final disciplinary measures. Her heart felt like it had been hooked by a giant fish and wrenched violently downward. She stared at the screen for a long time, reading those words until they blurred with her tears. Outside the realm of Delta, her personal life fared no better. Financial pressures crashed in like relentless waves against a flimsy sandcastle. Greg, her fiancé, remained unemployed despite his attempts to find new work. Their rent was 2 months overdue, and each day brought more letters and phone calls from creditors. Collection notices, their language growing bolder, stacked on the kitchen table. With no paycheck coming in, Lauren felt her savings evaporate at a terrifying rate. Anxiety gnawed at her daily. She woke up each morning to the crippling realization that she had nowhere to be, no flights to prepare for, no passengers to greet. The sense of purpose that came from her job, as well as the paycheck that anchored her life, had vanished. She began ignoring calls from family, too ashamed to admit the extent of her troubles. Sleep became an elusive ally, often replaced by restless nights on the living room couch, a cold cup of coffee growing stale beside her. Then came the final hammer blow. She arrived at a union meeting scheduled to discuss her fate. Trish was there, eyes weary, a thick folder of documents in hand. 2 representatives from Delta's HR team sat across the table, expressions stern but perfunctorily polite. They offered no small talk, only a swift reading of their decision. Miss Lauren Parker, following thorough review of the incident on Flight 347, the company has determined that your conduct was in violation of multiple policies, including but not limited to professional conduct standards. Your employment with Delta Airlines is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Lauren felt the words like a physical blow. Her knees weakened. She sank into the chair. The union's requests for lesser disciplinary action, requiring anger management, diversity training, or probation, had fallen on deaf ears. Delta needed to protect its brand integrity, and letting a controversial figure remain on staff was a risk they refused to take. She left the meeting in a daze, her ears ringing with corporate language about reputational harm and code of conduct violations. The next few days passed in a kind of muted horror. She returned her uniform and ID badge to the base office, the final act of surrender. That uniform had once symbolized a gateway to new places, a promise of adventure. Now it felt tainted, a reminder of mistakes she wished she could erase. At home, the atmosphere between Lauren and Greg was glacial. Each blamed the other for their dire situation, though they both knew it was more complicated than that. Their arguments escalated into shouting matches about money, about respect, about lost chances. Greg packed his duffel bag after one particularly vicious fight. He left without so much as a goodbye kiss, the slam of the door echoing in the empty apartment. With Greg gone and eviction notices piling up, Lauren was well and truly alone. She sat on the threadbare carpet, knees pulled to her chest, eyes red from hours of crying. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the silence. Her thoughts circled back to the moment on the plane. If only she could have controlled her temper. If only she had paused to think rather than snap. But regrets wouldn't pay her rent or restore her lost job. Late that night, while rummaging through her spam folder in a desperate search for any job lead or sign of hope, she saw it. An email from Delta's HR liaison with the subject line, "Invitation to a mediated meeting with Colonel Maxwell." Her heart lurched. Why, after all this, and after her official termination, would Colonel Maxwell want to see her? Did he intend to press legal charges or simply secure a final apology in person? Her hands trembled on the mouse. For a moment she considered deleting the message unread, too panicked to face the idea of seeing him again. But some flicker of curiosity, or perhaps a shred of dignity, compelled her to click open. The email explained that Colonel Maxwell had requested a private mediation, an opportunity to speak candidly in a neutral setting. She closed her eyes, pulse pounding, imagining what such a meeting might entail. Would he berate her further, demand reparations for humiliating him? Or was this some final test, a chance at closure? After all the vitriol that had come her way, both from strangers online and from her own guilt-ridden mind, the possibility of a peaceful dialogue seemed remote. Yet, as she hovered over the keyboard, one notion rooted itself firmly in her thoughts. Perhaps facing him was the only way to begin any semblance of atonement. That night, hunched on her living room floor amid half-packed boxes and overdue bills, she felt the full weight of karma. It had arrived swift and merciless, dismantling every pillar of her life. But maybe, just maybe, this meeting would be the first step in rebuilding from the wreckage. 2 weeks later, in a small conference room at Delta's corporate office, Colonel Maxwell and Lauren Parker finally came face to face. A neutral mediator employed by the airline oversaw the meeting. The walls were stark white, with generic art prints offering a faint attempt at warmth. Tension hung in the air like an unspoken verdict. Lauren arrived first, clad in a modest black dress. She looked pale, as though the stress of the past few weeks had siphoned the color from her cheeks. She drummed her fingers on a cup of water, occasionally glancing at the door. She half expected Colonel Maxwell to walk in flanked by lawyers, or worse, paparazzi. But he arrived alone, wearing a simple blazer and carrying a calm air about him. He offered Lauren a polite nod before sitting across the table. The mediator opened with a reminder that this conversation was voluntary, confidential, and aimed at fostering understanding, not retribution. For a long moment neither spoke. Lauren's eyes brimmed with tears she fought to contain. Colonel Maxwell finally broke the silence. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Miss Parker." She swallowed hard. I'm sorry," she began, voice shaking. "I can't express how ashamed I am of my behavior." He nodded, quietly acknowledging her words. "I appreciate that. I wanted to meet because I believe that dialogue can help us see past a single moment." He paused, scanning her face with genuine concern. "What happened on that flight? It felt very personal. But I also recognize that people carry burdens we don't see." Lauren's tears threatened to spill. I am under a lot of stress, but that's not an excuse for how I treated you. My anger that day was misplaced, and it came out horribly wrong." She looked down at the table. "I lost my job. I might lose my apartment too. I know that's karma, but I just want you to know I'm not proud of who I was that day." Colonel Maxwell took a deep breath, his voice gentle. "I'm sorry for your struggles. Truly, I am. I never wanted you to lose everything. My hope was to bring attention to what I felt was an incident of disrespect, possibly rooted in bias. But I believe in second chances, Miss Parker." Her eyes lifted, searching his face. She could barely believe the compassion she saw there. The mediator remained silent, letting them speak freely. Lauren leaned forward, voice trembling with remorse. "You've shown me more empathy than I deserve. I can't thank you enough. I want to learn from this and somehow make it right." Colonel Maxwell nodded, extending a hand across the table. In that moment, tears finally broke free from Lauren's eyes. She grasped his hand, feeling the warmth of a forgiveness she'd never thought possible. Following that emotional meeting, a sense of closure began to settle, for both Colonel Maxwell and Lauren Parker. Though she had lost her job at Delta, the seeds for a new beginning were quietly sown in that conference room. Colonel Maxwell reached out to some of his contacts, particularly within organizations that offered coaching and counseling for individuals dealing with conflict and unconscious bias. He also introduced Lauren to a friend who ran a local nonprofit focused on workforce re-entry. This friend didn't promise a job, but offered guidance, workshops, and networking opportunities. It was the kind of lifeline Lauren desperately needed. She threw herself into the program, attending every seminar, workshop, and counseling session. It wasn't easy. Her finances were still precarious, and the shame of her viral moment followed her like a shadow. But she clung to the chance for self-improvement and redemption. As for Colonel Maxwell, life didn't slow down. He returned to his duties, overseeing an upcoming training exercise. The story of the flight attendant and the colonel continued to resonate. He was invited to speak at a leadership conference where he shared insights about empathy, accountability, and the importance of seeing each person's humanity, even in moments of conflict. The audience gave him a standing ovation, moved by the raw authenticity of his message. Delta Airlines rolled out their new training program. The modules included real-life scenarios, focusing heavily on emotional intelligence and de-escalation. Though Lauren was no longer employed, her story became a crucial case study, used anonymously at first, to illustrate how personal stress can morph into discriminatory actions. Flight attendants reported that the training was eye-opening, prompting discussions about mental health support and implicit bias in the workplace. Gradually, as weeks turned into months, the online uproar subsided. News cycles moved on to new controversies and headlines. Colonel Maxwell's name returned to being recognized more for his military accomplishments and philanthropy than for a viral airline altercation. And Lauren slowly rebuilt her life, taking small steps forward every day. One afternoon, she received an unexpected package on her doorstep. Inside was a note from Colonel Maxwell typed neatly on a simple white card. "All we can do is learn and move forward. Remember, every day is a chance to do better. J. Maxwell." Tucked beside the note was a small pin displaying the insignia of his regiment, an emblem of courage, resilience, and the promise of new beginnings. Lauren held that pin and cried softly, realizing that while karma had dealt her a punishing blow, it had also led her to a humbling self-discovery. The real test of her character would be in how she rose from the ashes, and rise she did, buoyed by the empathy of the very man she had once scorned. Every conflict has a hidden door to understanding, if only we dare to open it. In this story, a flight attendant's anger collided with a decorated colonel's composure, sparking a chain reaction that none could predict. From public outrage to personal redemption, the journey proved that empathy can triumph over spite when we choose forgiveness over retribution. Even in the darkest moments, the light of second chances shines through. If this dramatic tale moved you, let it be a reminder. Our words and actions carry lasting weight, and every individual deserves respect. Thank you for joining us on this emotional ride. If you found meaning here, like this video, share it with friends who could use a story of hope, and subscribe for more powerful narratives that illuminate our shared humanity. Your support helps spread stories that can heal, inspire, and unite us all.